Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Morag Carter, and on behalf of the Lower Columbia Development Team Society, I am pleased to welcome everyone to this evening with Dr. David Suzuki. Before we start, I'd like to introduce Métis Elder Jerry Rempel, who will be giving tonight's territorial acknowledgement. Jerry?
Good evening. It truly is an honor this evening to acknowledge the people and the land within the territory of the West Kootenay within which we host this evening. And that is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Sinixt, the Syilx, the Ktunaxa, and the Secwepemc peoples. I also ask that all of you with us tonight who are not within this area also take a moment to acknowledge the territory within which you are located. Thank you very much, all my relations.
Thank you so much, Elder Jerry Rempel. The Lower Columbia Development Team Society, also known by its crazy acronym, the LCC-DTS, is an organization dedicated to building, sustaining, and sustainable community development in the rural industrial area of BC's southern interior. It's a region that includes the cities of Rossland and Trail, the villages of Warfield, Montrose, and Fruitvale, as well as the smaller rural communities of the Beaver Valley and Casino, Oasis, Rivervale, Janelle, and Columbia Gardens. As all of you know, this event was originally scheduled for May 2020, so I am especially delighted that so many of you have made the time to join us tonight to hear what Dr. Suzuki has to say about the state of the environment and particularly climate change coming out of the pandemic. The technology that we are using tonight also enables us to run polls and take questions from the audience. The first polling question of the evening is just to get you limbered up a little bit for more audience participation a bit later on. Our team will now launch a poll that you can access right beside the chat screen. The first polling question is, how many people in your household are watching tonight? We're hoping that all of your families are joining us as well. So we'd like to just get an idea of how many are, I think the second poll has shown up, which is which region are you tuning in from? So we know that there are people in the Kootenays and Boundary joining us tonight, but we're also wanting to see whether or not there are people from outside the region. Fantastic, thank you very much. The moderator of tonight's event is Mayor Diane Langman. Mayor Langman will be assisted by Montana Burgess, who is both the Executive Director of the West Kootenay Eco Society and the Chair of the LCC-DTS Sustainability Committee. Mayor Langman was first elected Mayor of Warfield in a by-election in 2017 when she became the youngest female mayor in BC. She was subsequently re-elected in 2019, and also in 2019, Mayor Langman was also selected as the chair of the regional district of the Kootenay Boundary. Mayor Langman has been a proponent of and an advocate for many sustainability and climate-related initiatives in the region, including 100% renewable Kootenays and the Warfield Food Charter and Food Advisory Committee. Nestled amongst the forests and the Selkirk and Monashee Mountains, the village of Warfield has also recognized its vulnerability to global heating. And in addition to its commitment to reducing emissions through 100% renewable Kootenays, Mayor Langman's team has also been considering adaptation measures designed to strengthen the community for the long term. Mayor Langman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Morag, and welcome everyone to an evening with David Suzuki. It is such an honor to be here tonight, and I hope that next time, and there will be a next time, this can be in person. Our region, the Lower Columbia and Boundary region, has experienced firsthand the impacts of climate change and the devastating impact it has had on our communities. We've had flooding risk in the spring, high drought levels, longer water restrictions, and of course, wildfires. The toll on our residents and our communities gets worse every time. The provincial states of emergency over record-setting wildfires and evacuation alerts that last longer each time. The cost to our residents and our communities, the damages to lost homes, local businesses and farms, and the direct cost for response and recovery. But we are taking steps. The RDKB declared a climate action imperative in October 30th of 2019. Rossland declared a climate emergency. We have local sustainable and food secure systems such as Trails Incredible Farmers Market, Warfield's Food Charter, the Boundary Food Hub, and Rossland's Food Security Task Force. We also have 11 local governments in the West Kootenays that have signed with the 100% renewable energy plan. So Rossland, Warfield, Fruitvale, Castlegar, Slocan, Silverton, New Denver, Nelson, Caslow, the RDCK, and most recently, Creston. Our communities are working on active transportation and also clean transportation plans. And there is always more that we can do, such as inviting award-winning scientist, environmentalist, and broadcaster, Dr. David Suzuki, to talk to us tonight about the climate crisis, the pandemic, and what we can learn and do better going forward. It is a personal honor for me to introduce David. We asked David to come and speak to people here in the Kootenay Boundary because we know people here are concerned and they know that they have to do something. They need to do more and they will listen to David's message. People here earn their paychecks from industries in our area, and they earn their paychecks from the people who earn their paychecks from the resource industries. We have mortgages to pay, children to put through school, and hopes and plans for a healthy future. Yet we also know that the climate crisis and the pandemic have changed the game. We all know David as a scientist and a broadcaster, a television host, a writer, and a columnist. His list of awards and accomplishments is longer than we have time to talk here. We all know he famously speaks his mind, and that's what we're looking forward to tonight. I asked Morag for a story to share about David when I introduced him, because she has worked with him at the David Suzuki Foundation. And you know, honestly, she said there are just too many. I will say that I've heard stories about your 85th birthday party earlier this year, Dr. Suzuki, and I've heard that you were told not to even think about retiring because there's still so much work to do. Tonight is about getting down to work. Please join me in welcoming the inspiring Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you so much, Diane, for that generous introduction. I'm speaking to you this evening from the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, who cared for these lands and waters for thousands of years, a true example of sustainability. Thank you for hanging in there through the crisis and not letting me off the hook for this talk. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to share a few ideas with you as the end of the COVID pandemic, once tantalizingly near, now continues to elude us, but it must not distract us anymore from a far greater threat. What I'm going to say, some of what I'm going to say may clash with your worldview, but I ask you, please don't write me off or immediately try to think of counter arguments. Instead, just listen and ponder my words, and then we can talk about it when I'm finished. I am not a historian, but I think we have to reflect more deeply on the experiences of the past to understand how we got here and what real challenges and opportunities confront us at this particular moment. I am a geneticist, so I have watched with great interest the development of tools and techniques to manipulate DNA, the genetic material. For example, by comparing DNA of different groups of people, scientists can measure their degree of relatedness and thus infer the movement of humans over time. And all trails lead back to Africa 150,000 years ago. That was our birthplace as a species. And I keep waiting for the Ku Klux Klan to invite me to speak to them so I can tell them, look, we're all Africans. What the hell's your problem? But back then, when we first appeared as an upright, furless ape, the grasslands of Africa were filled with animals in abundance and diversity beyond anything we could see today. Our ancestors in that context were not very impressive. There weren't many of us. We weren't big or strong or fast. We didn't have any special senses. I'm sure when we passed by, other species didn't hug their children and whisper, shh, don't piss them off. They're going to take over the planet. But we did have one impressive but invisible advantage, a complex brain that more than compensated for our lack of physical and sensory abilities. The human brain endowed us with a massive memory, and we were curious, we were observant and inventive. We learned from experience and could pass those lessons on from generation to generation. So cultural evolution was much faster than biological evolution that relies on mutation and shuffling of the genes at each generation. That brain amplified what our bodies could do with technology: spears, digging implements, rope, needles, stone axes. Many other animals use tools too. But the scale and variety of our technological innovation takes us to a whole different level. And our brain invented the idea of a future. You know, the future isn't real. The only thing that's real is now and what's going on in the past. But because we invented the notion, this concept of a future, no other species has a sense of the future as we do. And because of our memory and our observational ability, we realized we can affect the future by what we do in the present. Now, of course, at first it was very simple. I'm walking along a path and it branches into two. And I remember, oh yeah, Dad said when he went to the right once, he ran into a saber-toothed tiger. But my mom said, if you go to the left, you'll find some berries to eat. So I'm going left. I mean, that was it. Foresight, based on observation and experience, was the ability to anticipate the outcomes of our actions and thus deliberately choose to avoid danger and exploit opportunity. And it played a critical role in getting us to the present. It's such an important thing, foresight, that it's embedded in many of the stories that we tell. The Bible, for example, tells of Joseph warning the Pharaoh that a famine was coming, so store grain in preparation, and they avoided the disaster by getting through a 7-year famine. Remember Noah, this carpenter, told to build an ark, and he did it, and he stocked it with animals before the flood. And many indigenous stories amplify the wisdom of foresight. Today, scientists armed with supercomputers are acting in the best tradition of our species' survival. Look ahead, see the dangers and opportunities, and then take appropriate action. But now we are turning our backs on this survival strategy, from climate deniers to anti-vaxxers. In 1824, the French scientist Joseph Fourier described the greenhouse effect of certain gases. And by 1896, the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius suggested human burning of fossil fuels could warm the planet. By the 1950s, climate science was sufficiently robust for the United States National Academy of Sciences to study and report on the potential impact of global warming, which prompted President Lyndon Johnson to raise it as a serious issue in the early 1960s. But he was distracted by a war in Vietnam. By the late 1960s, President Jimmy Carter, who had a science degree and was trained in nuclear physics, he took the challenge of global warming very seriously. Remember, he turned down the thermostat, began to wear sweaters in winter, and installed solar panels on the White House. Ronald Reagan, a movie actor, defeated Carter and immediately tore down the panels. We now know for a fact that by the mid-1960s, the fossil fuel industry knew from its own scientists that burning fossil fuels was warming the planet. But rather than working to find alternate energy sources, they chose to hire PR experts from the tobacco industry, and they have spent tens of billions of dollars in a campaign of denigration of scientists and denial of the reality of climate change. Now, ever since Rachel Carson, a biologist, published Silent Spring about pesticides in 1962, public awareness and concern about the environment rose steadily and reached a peak in 1988 when Margaret Thatcher, a trained chemist, was filmed picking up litter and stating, "Well, I'm a greenie too." While that same year, oil man George H.W. Bush announced, "If you elect me, I will be an environmental president." He didn't have a green bone in his body, but he had to say it because the public had raised the environment to the top of their concerns. That year in 1988, Brian Mulroney was re-elected, and to show he really cared about the environment, he appointed his brightest star as the Minister of the Environment, Lucien Bouchard. I interviewed Bouchard a few months later and asked him, "What do you think is the most serious issue Canadians face today?" And immediately he said, "Global warming." I was very impressed, so I asked him, "How serious do you think it is?" And his answer was, "It threatens the survival of our species. We have to act now." But he didn't act. Instead, he quit federal politics to fight for Quebec separatism, much more important, I guess, than survival of our species. In 1988, a major conference on changing atmosphere, implications for global security, was held in Toronto, the first big international meeting on climate change. Among 300 delegates were cabinet members and other government representatives from more than 40 countries, as well as international scientists, NGOs, and UN representatives. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney gave the opening address. Norway's Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland gave the keynote speech. And climatologist James Hansen came and presented soon after he had testified before the United States Congress that he was 99% sure the warming trend that they were experiencing was not natural. Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Stephen Lewis, chaired the entire meeting. The press conference at the end of the meeting began, and I quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war." End of quote. The press release then called for an immediate national and international plan to confront the threat, including a commitment to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20% below 1988 levels in 15 years. Study after study showed that target could be achieved. It would save many lives, and it would result in net savings in the tens of billions of dollars in Canada alone. Had we used our foresight and seized the challenge, we could have avoided the crisis we face today. But we didn't even try. Why? Only Mr. Mulroney can answer that. But I think the problem was politics. He knew he would take a shit kicking from the fossil fuel industry for taking the issue seriously. His conservative base would howl at spending the billions of dollars needed up front to reduce emissions. And someone else would be in office to take credit 15 years later. Doing the right thing made no political sense. A year later, in 1989, The Nature of Things did our first show on global warming. As well, that year, I interviewed more than 100 scientists from around the world for a powerful 5-part radio series titled It's a Matter of Survival that resulted in 16,000 letters. Now, this was before email. And the letters said, look, I heard the show, you scared the hell out of me, but what can we do? And my wife said, look, Suzuki, you've been going around warning people of the problems. You can't keep doing that if you don't offer them solutions. So in 1990, we started the David Suzuki Foundation. Using the best scientific information available, we try to identify the underlying root causes of our destructiveness so that we can find concrete ways to change our path. In 1992, 1,700 senior scientists, these are top scientists from 71 countries, including more than half of all Nobel Prize winners alive at that time, signed a document called World Scientists Warning to Humanity. Some of what it said was, and I quote, human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost. Over half of all Nobel Prize winners signed this. Where were the headlines in the media screaming that the scientists were telling us? They were looking ahead and warning us of the dangers that face us. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio, the largest gathering of heads of state in human history, met to signal a shift in the way that we live on the planet. By then, George Bush revealed his oil bias and blackmailed the United Nations by saying he would only attend if there was a watered-down target, stabilized 1990 levels of emissions by the year 2000. It wasn't a reduction in emissions, but it at least acknowledged a cap on emissions. Canada signed, but didn't even try to meet that target as our emissions continued to rise steadily. I want to remind you that Canada is extremely vulnerable to climate change. We are a northern nation and are already warming at twice the global average, 4 times the average in the Arctic. We have the longest marine coastline in the world, so sea level rise is already hammering us. We boast of our great wilderness, but climate change is pulling apart ecosystems on land and sea, and we continue to knock down the vestiges of wilderness we have left. 30 years after 900 people were arrested for protesting logging old growth in Clayoquot, more than 1,000 have been arrested at Fairy Creek for protesting the same thing. 30 years have gone by, and we're still hammering at this nature that we boast we possess in Canada. And then there are climate impacted areas of the economy: agriculture, forestry, fisheries, tourism, and winter sports. In 1997 at Kyoto, delegates set a target for industrialized nations of a 5 to 6% reduction of 1990's levels of emissions by 2010. In 2002, Canada ratified Kyoto, so it became a formal international commitment. Then along came Mr. Willfully Blind, Prime Minister from Calgary, Stephen Harper. At Copenhagen in 2009, Canada proposed an even weaker goal, 17% reduction below 2005 levels, which in fact corresponds to 1.5% reduction above 1990 levels. That proposal was by the year 2020. In 2011, Harper knew we weren't even trying and pulled Canada out of the Kyoto Protocol, the only country to do so. After 9.5 years of a Harper government that willfully suppressed discussion of climate change, which surely is an intergenerational crime, Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015. He announced Canada was back and signed the Paris Agreement to keep temperatures from rising more than 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100, and we all cheered. 3 years later, Mr. Trudeau bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline, claiming we had to triple tar sands output for the taxes needed to reduce emissions. A ludicrous claim that is like saying, yes, we know smoking causes cancer, so let's sell way more cigarettes and use the tax money to find a cure for lung cancer. In October 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published a special report that concluded a rise of more than 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial temperature would destroy all hope of controlling its devastating impact on society. We are already at 1.1 degree. To avoid more than 1.5, the IPCC called for a 45% reduction in fossil fuel use by 2030 and 100% by 2050. The next day, marijuana became legal in Canada and pushed all discussion of urgent action on climate change out of the news. In May 2019, the United Nations released a terrifying report on biodiversity and ecosystem services that are the most important safety net against climate change, indicating humans have triggered a major extinction episode that has already wiped out countless species and threatens the imminent loss of another 1 million species. The day after the UN report was released, Harry and Meghan had a baby and pushed all other issues out of the papers. We've already frittered away more than 2.5 years of the 12-year period when the IPCC said we have to cut our emissions in half. Our new Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, came back from Madrid in December 2019 and announced Canada is committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And that is the refrain repeated over and over by Trudeau and the Liberals in this last campaign. Think about that. No emissions from fossil fuels by 2050? Sounds great. Wait. How many elections will there be between now and 2050? At least 7, probably more. And every new government acts as if anything the previous government did was crap, so forget about that. And how many members of parliament today will still be in office by 2050? None. So who is accountable when we don't meet the target? Who will go to jail or pay a fine? No one. Net zero by 2050 is no commitment. It's a political promise. And Canada has never even tried to meet a single political promise to reduce emissions. They say Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but what the hell are we doing today? Last year, 2020, was supposed to be a turning point in history. Remember, leading up to it, in 2019, massive demonstrations by millions of young people around the world, inspired by Greta Thunberg and demanding action to protect their very future against climate change. And then, as if to reinforce the urgency of their message, Australia and the west coast of North America went up in flames. But as 2020, the turnaround year, began, the world lockdown in response to COVID-19, a global pandemic, and that took over the news. Yet even as humanity slowed down and did give Mother Nature a break, George Floyd was murdered, and Black Lives Matter exploded around the world. Only a few weeks later in Canada, police murdered innocent Indigenous people, Chantal Moore and Rodney Levi in New Brunswick. Only egged on by people like Donald Trump, dog whistling his followers with words like China virus and Kung flu, anti-Asian racists have come out of the woodwork. And even now, as the pandemic weariness set in, we have been shocked by the revelation of hundreds of unmarked graves of children in residential schools, children who were torn from their parents and communities, forced to forget their culture, languages, even villages they came from. So they suffered alone, frightened, missing their parents, dying in droves and dumped into graves and forgotten. And last June, a cold-blooded murder of 3 generations of a family in London, Ontario, because they were Muslims. We cannot speak of a sustainable society when systemic racism is built into it. And the pandemic itself revealed tremendous inequities. Elders, the most honored members in Indigenous societies, were the overwhelming majority of victims of the virus, most of them in for-profit long-term care facilities where they died isolated and alone, cared for by underpaid, overworked staff who were themselves infected and dying disproportionately. And other groups, people of color, street people, the poor, low-wage workers in various facilities, farm laborers, prison populations, were 2 to 4 times more likely to die. While most people have struggled to make ends meet during the lockdown, the stock market has climbed to new heights as the ultra-rich have continued to reap huge profits. Yet big corporations lined up for government grants they then used to pay executives as the poor and the disabled beg for crumbs. Clearly, the economy has nothing to do with the well-being of people or the planet, yet it seems to determine everything our government does. Finally, the IPCC came out with a shocking report. Shocking because every report is vetted by all countries, Saudi Arabia, Russia, US, China, and have always been extremely conservative, so that predictions in every previous report have fallen far short of what actually happened. This one didn't pull back. We are in deep trouble. It said human use of fossil fuels is the heart of the cause, and 195 countries ratified the report. IPCC states we are already into a human-caused climate disruption, and regardless of what we do now, it will grow worse for decades and could well spin into chaos by 2030. Last May, the United Nations World Meteorological Organization announced there is a 40% chance we will hit 1.5 in the next 5 years. The next 5 years. And remember, if we stopped all emissions today, the temperature will continue to rise for decades. We've run out of time. As the UN head says, this is a code red planetary emergency. We have to respond as if this is a world war, and it is. This is World War III. Only the enemy is ourselves and the way we live. 4 weeks ago, Mr. Trudeau visited Rideau Hall and dropped the writ calling for an election. In the press scrum immediately after, I watched and listened. The top issues for the press were, number 1, Afghanistan. Remember that? Number 2, COVID. Then daycare. And maybe climate after that. Well, in the following days, climate has not been the only or the top priority that it should have been. But it was there for sure. We're supposed to feel happy about that. This election came at a historic moment. Post-pandemic, we must shift to a deep green, more just, more equitable way of living. But the window of opportunity to make incremental change has long passed. We have to have societal transformation. Get off fossil fuels starting now, and totally off fuels by before 2050, and hope to keep climate chaos from making the planet unlivable for human beings. British Columbians, remember the heat dome that killed 600 of us in a few days? That was just a teaser of what is coming. And we've got to be out there. We are the canaries, should be screaming about what the consequences might be. The media during this entire election didn't ask any leader, do you accept the IPCC reports as the authoritative source on climate? And do you agree with the report that says 80% of our known fossil fuel deposits have to be left in the ground? I am sure none of the leaders, well, perhaps the Greens, but none of the other leaders would agree to even one of those questions. Is the IPCC the source of our science? And will we leave 80% of our fossil fuels in the ground? Well, I believe the electorate has spoken. More voted for O'Toole than for Trudeau. But thanks to our first past the post system, which Trudeau had announced would be the last before his second term, Justin got, nevertheless, what he claimed was a victory and a mandate, neither of which was true. We got the best result we could hope for. No party got a majority. But if you look at the progressive parties, Liberal, NDP, Greens, Bloc, yes, Quebec has always been the greenest province, and the David Suzuki Foundation has worked extensively with the Bloc. Then a majority of Canadians want action on climate. That's what I believe the electorate said. I have written to Jonathan Wilkinson, who claimed the Environment Ministry was his dream job. He gave me his private email address, and in the past, he always answered my emails within minutes after I sent them. I sent this the day after the election. He hasn't answered it yet. I propose that climate is no longer a political issue owned by the Greens. It is an emergency, and to deal with that, we need an all-party climate emergency team, empowered to impose regulations for at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And if we can't meet that, then, well, who knows? Are climate change and biodiversity the cause of the crisis humanity faces at this moment? No. Those are just the symptoms. One species, Homo sapiens, that's us, has become the most numerous terrestrial mammal on the planet. And since every one of us needs food, water, clothes, and shelter, we have a huge ecological footprint. That is, it takes a lot of land, air, and water just to keep us alive. But of course, we are not like rats or rabbits or wildebeest. We have a huge amount of technology used on our behalf that amplifies our footprint. And we have become tremendous consumers served by the global economy. When you put all of that together, our population, our technology, our consumption, and our global economy, our ecological footprint is so great that we are altering the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the planet on a geological scale. That's why scientists now call this the Anthropocene epoch, the age of humans. The problem is that while we are an inventive creature, no doubt about it, we don't know enough to anticipate the negative effects of all we do. Think of DDT. Paul Mueller won a Nobel Prize for its discovery. Only much later, we learned about biomagnification up the food chain. The atomic bomb was dropped on Japan before we even knew there was a thing called radioactive fallout, electromagnetic pulses of gamma rays, or the possibility of nuclear winter. CFCs were used in massive amounts before we learned about the effects on the ozone layer. And in pharmaceuticals, the list is long. Thalidomide, DES, diethylstilbestrol, fentanyl. By applying our ideas on a massive scale, we undermine lives and the very life support systems of the planet, the air, water, soil, photosynthesis, and biodiversity that keep us alive and healthy. Yet despite that history of knowing how ignorant we remain, we're jumping into artificial intelligence, computers that think at the speed of light. We only think at a few hundred meters per second. Genetic engineering, nanotechnology, SMRs, small nuclear reactors, geoengineering, and space tourism. How did we get to this moment when many climate scientists have looked at me and said, we're fucked, where the very survival of all humans is at risk? For 95% of our existence, that's most of the time that we've been on this planet, we were just an upright, furless ape, following plants and animals on their migrations through the seasons, lugging everything we had on our backs. And in those conditions, you know very well, you are utterly dependent on nature. After about 50,000 years, the evidence suggests we began to move from the African grasslands into new territory. Scientists don't know why. Perhaps populations had built up enough so there were clans and clan rivalries. Maybe there were shortages of plants or animals, or I tend to think it was just a search for adventure. You know, humans mated with Neanderthal people, and maybe some teenagers said, hey, I hear there's some good-looking Neanderthals on the other side of that mountain, and they're so dumb, they're easy to get. I don't know, for whatever the reason, we began to move. And when we moved into new territories, we were an invasive species. We didn't know how things worked in the new lands, but we were smart, and even with simple tools, we were a deadly predator. You can follow as we moved across the planet. You can follow a wave of extinction of the slow moving or the big creatures. And, you know, it's thought we might have even eliminated saber-toothed tigers or even woolly mammoths. We don't know, but we were a very effective predator in these new territories. And we had to learn to live in these new lands in balance with these surroundings. And we did that through the observations, the mistakes, the successes, the failures, the experiences of the early people that came in. That is priceless knowledge to live sustainably. And that knowledge is the basis of indigenous cultures around the world. Hard-earned knowledge through mistakes, failures, and successes of our past ancestors. We've always known we are one small strand in a complex web of relationships with all other species and with air, water, soil, and sunlight. We've known other species of animals and plants are not resources or opportunity. They are our relatives who, in acts of generosity, give themselves to us. In such a web, everything is connected. So anything that we do has repercussions and therefore enormous responsibilities. An ecocentric perspective demands reciprocity. We celebrate nature and what we receive from her, and we acknowledge a responsibility to act properly so she can continue to be abundant and generous. 10,000 years ago, the last 5% of our existence, we discovered agriculture, which changed the course of human history. With a reliable source of food, we didn't have to move around looking for things to eat. We could build permanent structures, houses, which morphed eventually into villages and then towns. And as populations built up in one place, there had to be specialists like ranchers and farmers and carpenters and teachers and, I am sure, politicians. Religions developed to guide our behavior and relationships with each other and seem to suggest we are special and different from the rest of life on earth. By the Renaissance, Francis Bacon proclaimed, "Scientia potestas est," knowledge is power, and scientia, science, could advance society. René Descartes said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. And so the brain became paramount. The body was just there to support the mind. Isaac Newton, the great mathematician and physicist, thought of the universe as a clockwork mechanism, so it could be studied by pulling it apart and analyzing the pieces to see how the pieces worked and then put them together to see how the whole thing works. That way of approaching our search for knowledge is called reductionism. Today, reductionism is the primary way through which science perceives the objects of study, but it is fatally flawed. As Nobel laureate Roger Sperry pointed out, we may know everything there is to know, say about atomic hydrogen, and everything there is to know about atomic oxygen. But when you then say, put 2 atoms of hydrogen together with 1 atom of oxygen to make a molecule of water, what will the properties of water be? Knowing what you know about the properties of hydrogen and oxygen, and the only honest answer is, I'll be damned if I know. Because as Sperry points out, when you combine these different elements, there are what he calls emergent properties. New properties emerge from their combination that cannot be anticipated from what you know about the individual parts. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And yet most of science is based on looking at parts. The other problem with reductionism is that in focusing, we lose sight of the context within which the object exists. Geneticists think nothing of moving a gene out of a shark that makes a kind of antifreeze for the shark and putting it into a strawberry plant to resist frost. But the context that the gene finds itself is totally different from the context in the shark. It would be like putting Mick Jagger into the New York Symphony and asking them to play. You'd get a lot of sound, noise, but would you call it music? Studies of insecticidal properties of DDT were performed in flasks, in growth chambers, and controlled field plots. But in the real world, nothing exists in isolation. Wind blows, rain falls, water moves, and DDT ends up in rivers and lakes and fish, birds, and human beings with deadly consequences. The Industrial Revolution, beginning 300 years ago, created the delusion that our intelligence enables us to escape the laws of our limits of our biology, our muscles, our senses, or even natural laws. We created telescopes and microscopes, machines that work tirelessly around the clock, move immense weights or remove entire mountaintops. Vehicles travel faster than the speed of sound. We puncture Earth's crust, dam or divert great rivers, destroy entire ecosystems, dive the deepest oceans, even escape gravity and explore other planets. The only limit to human beings seems to be our imagination. And now we have computers to do the imagining for us. It's easy to see why we think we are special. And so we have exchanged our ecocentrism, where we saw that we were a strand in a web of connections, for anthropocentrism, in which we are the most important species. We're at the center of the action, and everything is for us. We just have to be more careful about the environment. But we're so smart, there are no limits to what we can do. And so we have built systems to guide and constrain us in this modern world, religious, legal, economic, and political, that are embedded in our anthropocentrism. There is nothing more anthropocentric and delusional than Christianity, that declares Jesus a human being as the Son of God. So we are all godlike, and we are instructed to go forth and multiply and fill the earth and subdue all of nature. Laws define property and human rights, but where in our legal system is the right of a bird to live its life as it evolved to, or a river to flow as it has for millennia, or a forest to exist as a community of organisms? Quebec recently recognized the legal status of the Magpie River, but that was only because it was treasured for its beauty and recreational values for us. And who the hell do we think we are anyway, that we can confer rights on everything? And what about the borders that we draw around countries, provinces, and property? Nature doesn't care. When fire broke out at Chernobyl, it was Swedish scientists who announced an accident had occurred because of a spike in radioactivity. Air doesn't stay within national borders. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney doesn't know that when he tells us to butt out of Alberta's fossil fuel use. I say to Jason Kenney, you want to dig it up, burn it, you want to do whatever you want with it, and I'm fine with that, so long as whatever you do doesn't in any way get out of Alberta. Salmon born in BC waters pass through the Alaskan Panhandle to travel along the coast from Alaska to Russia, China, and Japan. Yet each country tries, unsuccessfully, to manage salmon through its own national laws. Our economic system is based on the philosophy of cancer, endless growth, which is impossible in a finite world. But when we think that growth is the very measure of progress, we never ask the important questions. What is an economy for? Are there no limits? How much is enough? Are we happier with all this stuff? Perhaps during the Q&A, I can show you why the pursuit of endless growth is suicidal. But at this point let me just say that in a finite world, nothing can grow forever. And because the economy is built on human creativity and human production, nature is considered an externality. So when we destroy a forest, flood a valley, or burn down an ecosystem, that's just collateral damage that is the price of doing business. Recently, UK economist Partha Dasgupta released a massive report showing that the economy is inevitably ecologically destructive because it pays no attention to nature and all the things she does to keep the planet habitable for animals like us, like removal of carbon from the air and return of oxygen by plants, creation of soil, filtration of water, pollination of flowering plants, capture of energy from the sun, and so on. All of that is irrelevant in our economic system. Mark Carney, in his book, Values, Building a Better World for All, points out that Amazon, the colossal company, is valued by the economy in the hundreds of billions, while Amazon, the greatest ecosystem on the planet, is only valued economically when the forest is destroyed and the land becomes productive for human purposes with dams, cattle ranches, soybean farms, or cities. It is suicidal when our very lives and well-being are made possible by nature. The economy itself is built on nature for raw materials, energy, and waste disposal. I and my foundation have been fighting against the development of Alberta's tar sands, the dirtiest fossil fuel for years. 4 or 5 years ago, I received a call from the CEO of one of the largest companies in the tar sands. Could I come and talk to you, meet you? He said. I said, of course. I'm not into fighting. Come and talk to me. The next day, he came from Fort McMurray to my office, and I greeted him warmly. I thanked him, said how honored I was for him to come. I said, before you come in my office, please do me one favor and leave your identity as the CEO of an oil company outside. I want to meet you as one human being to another, with another. And I want to see, what do we agree on? What's the point of talking about carbon taxes and pipelines and climate change if we don't start from a point of agreement? Well, this is not what he came down for. And he is a good man. So reluctantly, he came into my office. And so to his credit, I said, look, I know this isn't what you expected, but I hope that we can agree that we live in a world that is shaped and constrained by laws of nature, and we can't change them. We have to live within them. I told him, physics reveals we can't build a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of sound. We know that. The law of gravity says if you hit your trip on the stairs, you're going to hit your head on the floor. And the first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us you cannot build a perpetual motion machine. These are laws of nature, and we understand we live within them. Chemistry is the same. The atomic properties of the elements determine melting points, freezing points, boiling points, reaction rates, diffusion constants. We know then that the laws of chemistry tell us what we can and cannot make. And biology reveals that every species has a maximum number that can be sustained indefinitely. Exceed that number and your population will crash. And that number is set by what's called the carrying capacity of an ecosystem or a habitat. Now, humans aren't confined to an ecosystem or a habitat, but the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists, supports us. And scientists agree our numbers and consumptive demand exceed the carrying capacity of the biosphere. But we maintain the illusion that everything is sustainable by gross inequities that mean a tiny number of super rich get richer and consume vast quantities. Think clothes, cars, houses, boats, planes, even trips into space, while more and more people are crushed into starvation and premature death. And collectively, we are using up what our children and future generations should have been able to have. Gee, I see that the sun is set and it's getting dark. Excuse me for 1 second. Could you turn on that light? Thank you.
Turn on that one too.
That's fine. I don't know if that's any better, but biology also informs us we are animals. I attended the first annual meeting of the Green Home Builders in the United States in Austin, Texas in the 1990s at 3,000 people. And in the front rows were a whole bunch of children. So I said in my speech, now kids, if you remember one thing from my speech, remember we are animals. Man, I was shocked. Their parents were so pissed off at me. This woman came up and said, don't you call my daughter an animal. We're human beings. And I said, madam, I'm sorry, I'm a biologist. If your daughter isn't an animal, is she a plant? We are animals. And as biological creatures, I told the CEO, we share most of our genes with carrots and cedar trees, with eagles, fish, and fruit flies. All life is related, and our nearest kin are the great apes. All other species deserve to be loved and treated with respect because they're our kin. And then I said to him, what do you think is the most important thing every human being needs? And instead of giving me the answer right away, he went, and I could see he's thinking a job, money. I said, if we don't have a breath of air for 3 minutes, we're dead. If you have to breathe polluted air, you're sick. So I said, would you agree with me? Air is a sacred gift from nature, and that in using it, we have a responsibility to ensure that air remains clean and pure for all the other creatures on earth that are going to use it. And then I said, you and I, we are 60 to 70% water by weight. We're just a big blob of water. Got enough thickener added, we don't dribble away on the floor, but we do leak water all the time, you know. Comes out of our nose and our mouth and our eyes and our crotch and our skin. And I said, if you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. If you have to drink polluted water, you're sick. So clean water is like clean air, a sacred gift. And then food is a bit different. We can go a lot longer, but 4 to 6 weeks without food, we die. And most of our food is grown in the soil. So clean soil and food are like clean water and clean air. And then I said, all of the energy in your body and mind that we need to grow and work and reproduce, move, all of that energy is sunlight, captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy. And then we eat the plants, or the animals that eat the plants, and we store that energy in our bodies. And when we have to do work, we burn that energy and release the energy of the sun back out in our bodies. So photosynthesis is like clean soil and food, clean water and clean air. And then I said, Mr. CEO, the miracle of life on this planet is those 4 things that indigenous call earth, air, fire, and water. Those 4 things are cleansed, created, amplified by the web of living things. That life itself, our relatives, create earth, air, fire, and water that we can use. And so I said, those are the foundation of the way we live. Earth, air, fire, water, and our relatives. Other things, religions, governments, corporations, economies, the market, currency, these are not forces of nature. We invented them. We can't change nature, but we can change the things that we invent. I said to him, if you will shake hands with me on what I have just said, I pledge I will do everything I can to help you and your company. So what did he do? He couldn't shake hands with me. He was a good man. He loves his kids. He goes to church. He told me he loved going camping. But if he were to return and talk to his shareholders and say, well, I had a talk with Suzuki, and we must not do anything to degrade the air, water, soil, or affect other species, he'd be fired in a minute. That's not his job. So the game is rigged, and nature will lose every time. And we are told that democracy is the best political system ever built, a system in which government policy and action are guided by the voting patterns of all citizens. But those most affected by what governments do or do not do are children, our future generations. For that matter, trees, fish, birds, oceans, the atmosphere, none of them vote. So they're not on the political agenda. The Ministry of Fisheries and Oceans, he's not there to protect fish in the oceans. He's there to look out for the rights of the people that vote for him. The Environment Minister, sorry, it was a woman. She's no longer, she lost the job, but the last Minister, Fisheries and Oceans, is a woman. But people, the Environment Minister doesn't represent or protect the environment, but us. And so on it goes. Minister of Forests, the Minister of Resources. Today, our actions are leaving enormous ecological deficits that are not on today's payrolls, but will be paid by future generations who will have to live with a profoundly degraded planet. Mark Carney points out this is an egregious abrogation of intergenerational responsibility, and it is the direct consequence of the current economic paradigm. However sophisticated we may be in our modern world, We remain biological creatures dependent on clean air, clean water, clean soil and food, clean energy from the sun and all other species of plants and animals to live and live well. Until we acknowledge that and base all the ways that we act and think on a foundation of responsibility to protect and restore nature, our economic, legal, and political systems will continue to justify and sanction our destructiveness. A carbon tax may be an effective economic tool, but it only helps perpetuate the economic system itself. Incremental change, a new law or a regulation here, an economic incentive or a tax there, a political promise due to public pressure, are not enough. We need transformative change. The great opportunity today is that there are still people who live through ecocentric values, who fight for their territory, which is everything to them, because aside from the benefits they get from nature, they have an overwhelming sense of responsibility to protect and care for the land. Of course, I'm speaking of Indigenous people all over the world, the only people with a track record of living sustainably in place for thousands of years. What corporation or government can make that claim for a century or even a decade? We settlers have to rediscover Indigenous values to shape our policies, strategies, and actions, because clearly the dominant paradigm doesn't work. I'm not saying Indigenous people have all the answers. They don't, because the world is radically changed from the one in which their cultures were developed. It took Haida months to cut down one great cedar tree to build their canoes or their longhouses or totems. They burned a bit, then chipped away at the ashes with stones, then they burned and chipped for weeks and weeks. Today, one person and a chainsaw can do it in minutes. And here, I think environmentalists provide support for the Indigenous cultures with EBM, ecosystem-based management. What Indigenous people offer is the way they perceive our relationship with nature that guides and shapes their actions. I'm always amazed that despite all that has been done to stamp Indigenous people and their cultures out of existence, they are willing to teach and share with us. They tell me again and again, we're all in the same canoe. We have to paddle together. The principles of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provide a path to social justice, but just as important, to guide all of us to find a better way of living on this planet, because we cannot go back to the way things were before the COVID lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzuki. That was an amazing, we have so much to think about, and you've given us so many thoughts and ideas, and wow, thank you so much for being here with all of us. We have a few questions that are starting to come in. We'll remind everyone, if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat, and Montana is going through those to add them in. Our first question for this evening is, what is the cost of recent disasters? This year, we saw so much, not only fires, heat dome, but floods and tornadoes. This would include the loss of life from COVID and heat dome, and even lives lost to opioid pandemic worsened by COVID. There is the cost of disaster mitigation and relief, loss of homes, farms, crops from drought and heat, and cost of rebuilding after disaster, plus the loss of business, livelihood, family members, and general wellness. What is the price on all of those costs to help people understand the true monetary cost of our limited action?
But why is that even a relevant question? I've told you that the whole economic system, the attempt, how do you put a price on something that is sacred? You know, I don't see the point of trying to put a monetary value on it. It's those things are just warnings of what is to come. I mean, you know, British Columbians got the warning years ago when our northern forest turned bright red. That to me was the biggest shock of my life. The mountain pine beetle exploded because winters aren't cold enough to keep the beetles under control. And while I mean, you could put a price on using market prices of the pine forest. That would be easy to do. It's of course, in the billions of dollars. But you know, am I supposed to be able to put a price on my mother's life if she died? I mean, you can't put a price on that. And besides, I just think that that's the problem. If we try to meet a crisis by saying how expensive it is, it's no. I'm sorry, I just can't get into that.
Thank you, and thank you for your honesty. Are you concerned about people not getting vaccines and that leading to the end of the human species?
No, it's not going to end the human species. I mean, this is certainly not a killer that, you know, it's not like SARS or Ebola or any of these other diseases that have broken out. I think we're very lucky in that. You know, the number of fentanyl deaths is far greater than the number of COVID deaths in this province, I think. But I think that it was a terrific warning to us. And what it revealed was, you know, the only thing we can possibly manage is us. We can't manage air or water or other species or ecosystems. We know we don't know enough to manage anything. The only thing we can manage is us. And what COVID revealed was we can't even manage us. You know, the people that they are the absolute example of people who have turned their backs on the survival mechanism that got us here, which is foresight. Now we have the authority of scientists. They don't know everything. You know, I've had people criticizing Bonnie and Fauci and saying, look at that, they're changing. What the hell? We've never had a crisis like this before. Their suggestions are only as good as the data. More people have to die or get sick before they can think, well, what can we do to try to, you know, they're just making it up as they go to the best of their ability. But it is the best we've got. And when you start getting down into rabbit holes of conspiracy and all of this other junk, not asking the important question, who's paying for these websites or what's behind who's putting out this information? If we don't say what is authoritative knowledge, we're in deep trouble. The people, of course, I think governments have tried to assure the vaccine for everyone. There must be no one left behind. And I think governments have done a very good job of ensuring isolated communities, people like Indigenous people, be sure to get their shots. Those that are denying the reality, who are claiming it's their right to freedom, simply don't get it. The air that comes out of their nose goes straight up their next door neighbor's nose. We live in a matrix of air that doesn't belong to anyone. We're all sharing it. And to think that my freedom comes from doing something to that air without any responsibility, that is the failure, the thing that happens when we look at the world in an anthropocentric way. The minute you see an ecocentric way, you think, oh my God, you know, we have a global pandemic. This is a global health issue. And we have a responsibility to do everything we can not to exacerbate that problem. Masks, maybe, I don't know how effective masks are, but they may be one way. And then I think it's our responsibility is to take whatever possibility is there. And those who refuse to take the vaccine, turn their backs on one of the few great innovations from medicine, and that's vaccination. There is no greater contribution. The second one would be antibiotics from the medical community. Most medical interventions are treating the symptoms. They're not getting at the actual cause of the problem, trying to make you feel a little better. So those people that turn their backs on it, it seems to me, in exerting their right, their freedom, have said that my responsibility ends at you. Well, then why are we providing all of the medical facilities to care for them when they get sick? It seems to me, by excluding themselves from what is a public health issue, they are saying that they should not be allowed to use any of the health facilities that we've set up for everyone. Now, a lot of people think this is a horrible thing to say, but I'm just responding to what they're saying. They don't care about anybody else's health or well-being, even though they're a part of it. Why then should we care for them when they get sick?
Thank you for your thoughts.
Let me say, my grandson was born with a fluid on his ear that impairs his hearing. And thank goodness he is able to get an operation, and they put a drain in that drains it, but the drain falls out. And his hearing is built up, and he's 3.5 years old. He's now beginning to slur and speak funny because he can't hear properly. He had an operation scheduled months ahead, but now he's being turned down because it's not life-threatening, because the hospital in Victoria is overwhelmed with unvaccinated COVID patients.
Yes, that is the heartbreaking end of this, along with many other people whose surgeries are delayed as well. It's a hard time. Our next question is, what do you think about passive buildings? Do you support this building strategy?
I'm not sure I know what that means. Passive heating, solar heating, or whatever. I'm sure, I have no idea what the answers are going to be. We can all try in our own way, and if that's the way of reducing our emissions, great. Whatever we can do, we've got to get started now. Now, the current government, this is a third term for the Liberal government. Trudeau is claiming he has a mandate, that he won the election, and yet his government clearly has demonstrated that they are not taking the steps that are really needed. And Jonathan Wilkinson's a bright guy. He's given me direct access to him through his personal email. I stopped emailing to him over 6 months ago when I said, John, I know you're constrained what you can do by politics, but at least, for God's sakes, tell us the truth. Tell us how serious the problem is. I said, you're not telling the truth. I don't see the point in talking to you anymore if you're not even going to do that. And that's why when I emailed him after the election, that's the first time I've emailed him in a long time. He hasn't responded. But we've got to stop acting as if it's a political issue. This is now an emergency, and we have to treat it like it's an emergency. It's not one political party's issue, it's all of us. And we've got to act in that way. Now, what I see, if we have a climate emergency team and they're able to impose regulations demanding reductions in energy, they've got to divide the various sectors up that are that have a climate impact, and that goes from farming to energy to agriculture, forestry, fisheries, all of those sectors, transportation, and building is certainly a huge one of them. And we've got to begin to make the changes, but let's not confuse incremental changes, doing a small change here and there, with the really deep changes that are needed. The incremental changes are all just going to add up in the end to what I hope is big changes. For me, what I told Wilkinson is, you guys are elected to do the big things because it's in your power to do that. The public is anxious and wants to do something. And I pledge to work, I hope, with all in other environmental groups and get the Canadian public to reduce their personal energy use by 25% in a year. If we can show the public is ready to do its part, then we look to government to do the big lifting. And, you know, after the Fukushima accident in Japan, the Japanese people, without any legislation, voluntarily reduced their energy use by over 20%, and they have maintained that reduction through all the years since Fukushima. So I know it can be done, and we just need a big campaign. But we need the leadership at the level of government because they have to make some big decisions.
Absolutely. All right. So we have climate.
Yes, Diane, I
Yes.
have to say, you know, hearing the introduction to Diane, I'll tell you, I had goosebumps going up and down my back because you've got it. You see, politicians have downloaded the problem. Oh, it's not a federal problem, it's provincial. Oh, it's not a provincial, it's you guys are at the end of the line. You have to act. And hearing about people like you, just thank you. I'm so grateful that you're there. And I think the people of your area are very fortunate, and it's happening all over. Vancouver has a fantastic city council. I mean, they really got the message and they're going at it. At the municipal level, all kinds of things are happening.
Thank you so much. We are the boots on the ground and we're deeply rooted in our communities. And we are very fortunate to have small communities where we have a lot of very involved residents here. I'm super proud to be a Kootenay kid, born and raised. So we're pretty proud, that's for sure. All right, so we have climate agreements to be fossil fuel free by 2050. What about a breakdown of 3 to 5 year agreements for climate actions that communities need to adopt in order to meet targets? Yeah,
exactly. That's what the flaw in what Wilkinson is saying. He keeps saying net zero by 2050, but and I know Elizabeth May tried to get put into place the legislation that demands that targets be met starting with year one. If we don't have a way of beginning, then all of these politicians will delay and delay, thinking they can have a curve that goes like this. But what is needed is a curve that goes like this, you see? And so we need the demand that we begin right away. And that, you know, there are a lot of things that can be done immediately. You cancel a pipeline. You cancel all exploration. You cancel all subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. You know, actually, money is not really the challenge. It's the commitment. We have to make the commitment. And once that's made, magic happens. So this is what I'm pressing. Wilkinson is, for heaven's sakes, make the commitment. We have to start reducing fossil fuel use right now. We will work as hard as we can with the workers in the fossil fuel to make a transition and all that. But this is the target we have to work on. Once that happens, all kinds of things are going to take place. And I'm sorry it's going on, but I like to use, you know, I've been supporting Seth Klein, who wrote the book, A Good War, all about what Canada did during World War II. And it's such an inspiring story. Canada was a rinky-dink country in 1939 when Britain went to war. 11 million people, and yet 1 million Canadians signed up to put their bodies on the line by joining the army. And then you look at, you know, by the end of the war, we had 140,000 people working in the aviation industry. At the beginning of the war, we were turning out 40 planes a year. And we were turning out hundreds a month by the end of the war. I mean, and the GDP grew by 2.5 times. I mean, look at the book. It's really inspiring. What I like to do is talk about what happened when I was beginning my last year in college in the United States on October 4th, 1957. We were shocked when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. This is in the middle of the Cold War. And, you know, every American rocket, the Army, Air Force, Navy rocket that went up, blew up. And meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal, the dog Laika, the first man, Yuri Gagarin, the first team of cosmonauts, the first spacewalk, the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. The Americans just dug in and said, we got to catch up. Nobody said, oh, we can't afford to do that. It's too late. And in 1962, Kennedy said, we choose to send our men and women to the moon and back within a decade. In 1962, they had no idea how they were going to do it. He just said, we got to do this. And look at what happened. Not only are the US the only country to land people on the moon, but every year, 60 years later, every year when Nobel Prizes are announced, guess who still gets most of them? American scientists or scientists working in America. And then every year, NASA publishes a magazine called Spin-Off. And it lists hundreds of things that spun off from the space program: laptop computers, GPS, satellite communication, space blankets, ear thermometers. I mean, nobody knew what would happen. Nobody knew how to do it. They just made the commitment. And that's what we need at the level of governments. Say, this is a climate emergency. And we've got no choice. We got to get off fossil fuels very, very quickly. And this is what we're aiming for. That's what we have to do.
Thank you. What do you think we here tonight can do to affect politics around the climate emergency, together and as individuals?
We have to, now is the most important time to really put the pressure on our politicians now. I supported Sid Canning, and because I knew him in zoology, he took my course. I don't think he got a great grade, but that's okay. He's a good guy, and I'm delighted he's in there. But now we have to have the pressure on. You see, one of the problems with the Liberals, they talk a great line. And the only time I ever voted for a party that won the election was in 2015. I was so desperate to get rid of Harper that I voted strategically, and I voted for Joyce Murray, who's very good. I'm really glad that she's in there. She understands the climate portfolio very, very well, and but she supports the pipeline. Why? Because she's whipped. They whip their members in line. You have to say that. Every party but the Greens whips their people into line. So we now have to keep pressure on whoever we've elected in our area. We've got to keep after them and say, climate, climate, climate. Stop this bickering over other things. Climate, support the whoever is in power. Support them if they make climate our top thing, and we'll work together. That's what we have to get our representatives to make that their priority. So this is the most important time. I believe we won, the public won by keeping a party from winning a majority. So now we have to work harder.
Absolutely. All right, we are on to our final question for the evening. Dr. Suzuki, do you have hope? And if so, where does it come from? And how can we have hope?
People get their hope from all kinds of things. It can be a hopium, as some people say. It can be your protection. It's, oh, well, you know, something's going to happen. We don't want that kind of Pollyanna-ish hope. Hope really has to be grounded, I think, on reality. And for me, and quite frankly, I have undergone much despair. And, you know, in this area, it's very hard to avoid despair. Fortunately, my wife and I are cycling on a different time frame. When I'm down at the bottom, she's able to pull me out of it, and vice versa. So that's worked out. I dread when we both hit the bottom at the same time. But what pulls me out, what really gives me hope, is nature. In 2009, you know, the the most valued species of salmon in the world is the sockeye salmon. And that's got the red, fatty flesh that we love so much. The biggest sockeye run in the world is in the Fraser River. Before contact with humans, we think there may have been up to 120 million sockeye that would run in a year. After humans came and, you know, blew up the pass and plugged the river, we now think if you get 30 million sockeye, that's a good run. In 2000, I think it was 2009 or 2008, we got just over 1 million sockeye. And I remember turning to Tara, my wife, and saying, that's it. There isn't the biomass to get them up to the spawning grounds. They're toast. The next year, we got the biggest run in 100 years. And I was stunned. You know, nobody knows. There was a commission set up to find out what the hell happened. What happened to them the year they disappeared, but what happened to them the year they bounced back? Nature, we don't know much about nature, and I think nature will surprise us, and a lot of it will be good. We don't deserve it. But if we can pull back and give nature a chance, then I believe that nature will be far more forgiving than we deserve. The crisis, the challenge at Fairy Creek goes to the heart of what the problem is. Those kids there that are being arrested in huge numbers are saying we've got to stop this destruction of the very source of knowledge about how nature thrives. It's our ancient forests that hold the keys. We've got to protect, but they are also part of the safety net for climate, against climate change. So we've got to stop destroying any of it anywhere in the world. I personally have said I'm going to go to the indigenous people whose land that is and help them get that land back so that they can apply their sovereign techniques, gain sovereignty to apply their traditional techniques to care for those forests. But nature is my hope. And I just this week narrated a Nature of Things program that takes a tiny look at what has happened to nature during the lockdown. And I'll be totally honest, I am shocked. I am really shocked because, you know, just by our beginning to imprison ourselves, nature is still out there and creeping back. In one area, they got 3 times as many ruby-throated hummingbirds near airports, now that the airports were shutting down or slowing down. And you begin to see that nature can come back, but they're being kept down by us. So I think the first thing we've got to stop is any continued destruction of nature. Stop evaluating a forest on the basis of fiber or board feet of lumber. We've got to look at that as a priceless gift that is still there and look to that gift to provide us the leadership, the way out of the problem that we're in. And I have great hope if humans can learn to control themselves. That's the hardest job of all.
I agree. And I love the line, nature is my hope, because here in the Kootenays and in the Boundary region, we are surrounded by nature. We are so lucky and fortunate to live where we do, and nature is absolutely our hope. Thank you so much, Dr. Suzuki. I'll pass it over to Morag to close for the evening.
Thank you so much, David. It was lovely for you to spend the time with us. Thank you very much.
I'm waiting for some whitefish.
It's on its way. Thank you to Mayor Diane Langman and to Elder Jerry Rempel. Thank you to Montana Burgess, the committee members of the LCC DTS, and the staff of the Eco Society, the Regional District of Kootenay Boundary, and the Skills Center for their technical expertise and support tonight. Thank you also to our sponsors, Tech Metals Limited and the Columbia Basin Trust. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. Good night.